Hello, and thanks for joining me today. I'm very happy to be here and to share some ideas about how Mexico, Mexicans, and lo Mexicano has been portrayed through visual culture. Thanks to Dartmouth University for this invitation, and I hope you enjoy this brief conversation. Visual culture in Mexico is very rich, so I'm going to concentrate in the golden age of the Mexican cinema and in photography in the first half of the 20th century. Some scholars suggest that Mexicans sometimes seem to be obsessed with the question of identity, wondering who we are. But however, a consensus on what lo mexicano and mexicanidad refer to is clearly impossible. Why? We are a multicultural country. We are full of cultures, so it's something specific that refers to lo mexicano. It's pretty impossible to find. So what some scholars and intellectuals have suggested, according to Roger Bartra, about these ideas are actually stereotypes that have been manipulated for political ends. For this conversation, I have chosen two paradigms. One is the golden age of Mexican cinema, and the other one is photography in the 20th century. Why? Well, there is a big impact of visual culture in Mexico. Also, as John Russ states, identity and lo mexicano has been constructed through visual culture. We also have large archives with cinema and photography, and there is a wide scope. Finally, well, both are well developed in Mexico, and there is a long historical tradition. So let's start with our first paradigm, the golden age of Mexican cinema. The golden age of Mexican cinema goes from the 1930s to the 1950s. In this time, the Mexican cinema are filled with folkloric and traditional images of Mexico. Of course, what it's considered to be folkloric and what they want to consider as traditional. Something we need to understand is that the Mexican cinema was very much controlled by the state. So many of the messages that we're going to find in the films are actually promoted by the states. The movies are going to idealize rural Mexico. Why? Because Mexico at the time is mostly rural. Not that many people live in cities. The countryside seems like a paradise to live in. And of course, Mexico is full of nice landscapes, and the rural Mexico is beautiful. However, it's going to ignore the poverty. It's going to ignore how the peasants were suffering after the Mexican Revolution. These movies are going to promote also national values. These national values can be, for example, the good manners, how people should behave, who are those who we have to respect. In contrast, it's interesting, we are also going to see the Mexican macho, who is someone who breaks the rules and is very strong, a womanizer, the charro, let's say, or the ranchero. This is going to be constructed during this time in the Mexican cinema. There is also representation of a national image, how we want to be seen outside Mexico, how we want to be seen by Mexicans. This is Mexico. And very important as well, poverty is going to be constructed as a virtue, something that actually makes you happy, something that makes you a good person, rather than wanting to have more and wanting to have more material things. As I said it, at this time is when the idea of the macho Mexicano is created. So men were actually the real protagonists in the golden age. Women are represented as objects of desire. And of course, we have fantastic actresses from the time, very, very famous, really good ones like Blanca Estela Pavón, Dolores del Rio, of course, Maria Felix. However, most of the roles are going to be like reacting. They do not act, but actually they are the objects of desire, something to achieve, something to reach, but they do not necessarily participate in their own fate. So what images do we mostly find in the golden age of Mexican cinema? Well, Alejandro Carrillo tells us that we're going to find mostly a country of drunken charros, murderers, and troublemakers. Of course, all this is going to be like sugar-coated in comedy, through humorous ideas, stories. And this charro is going to be created as the image of something typically national. And it's going to be repeated over and over during the golden age in the films. So probably this gave some character, some form to the movies, to the Mexican movies at the time. So many of the national archetypes are going to be created during the golden age of Mexican cinema. We have, for example, the Peladito, that is Cantinflas, the Pachuco, that is represented in Tintan, the Charro, and the self-sacrificing woman. Those characters are going to appear constantly in the Mexican cinema at this time. The actors and actresses of this period created characteristics of lo mexicano for audiences. They are going to appear in different stories, in different moments. However, they are going to insist in some of these characteristics that they're going to have. For example, Cantinflas with his barrio accent while he's speaking. This is going to be created for this character, and nowadays is considered to be like an accent that many people in Mexico City have. Then it seems to be clear that it's really hard to point out something like exclusively Mexican or something like represents all Mexicans or lo mexicano. What we're going to find in the golden age of Mexican cinema is actually a big amount of stereotypes which are going to be insisted in the different movies, in different stories. As I said, for example, the barrio accent. Also the submissive women, which are going to be observed not only in lovers, but also in mothers, in daughters, and as well the subjugation of wife and children to the father. So the macho image is going to be constantly appearing in different types of men. Another interesting thing to observe is this paradox in this cinema. On one side, we have these men who are immature, alcoholic, violent, but on the other side, some values were promoted, such as Catholicism, Guadalupanismo, the respect to the family, the love to your mom. So this clashes with the idea of the macho who is an abusive man. Some other values were promoted. As I said, poverty was seen like something positive, like something that it was going to make you happy, even actually happier than rich people. Rich people were unhappy. Poor people were actually happier. Why is this? Well, let's think it's the time we are some years after the revolution. So many Mexicans are going to live in poverty. So cinema seems to be like a good propaganda to find poverty as something that it's okay, that it's going to help you to overcome yourself and to feel much better. If you saw people like Pedro Infante singing despite his economical situation. So something that is pretty clear is that most of the cinema made during the Golden Age has no political message. Cinema is going to be one of the favorite arts in Mexico and for Mexicans. So celebrities became models of Mexicanidad. The screen star became examples of lo mexicano. But of course, these examples are going to be created, are representations made by someone else, and are going to be created also with political reasons, for propaganda reasons, how in many ways Mexico should be seen outside or by the own Mexicans. So, for example, the creation of El Peladito or El Charro, but also, for example, the portrayal of indigenous persons. The indigenous people are going to be performed mostly by white actors or actresses, are going to be set on rural areas mostly, dressed up with a very unique way of dressing, forgetting that actually there are different groups, indigenous groups in Mexico, and making like the idea, the myth, that there is only one indigenous group, that all the indigenous people in Mexico are homogeneous, which is actually just a myth. Let's move now to our second paradigm, Mexican photography in the first half of the 20th century. As it happened with cinema, photography arrived in Mexico very early in time. It might be around the 1830s and the 1840s. However, the photographs were mostly made by foreigners. One of the first, or some of the first Mexican photographers are going to be Antioco Cruces and Luis Campa. They are going to follow some foreign tradition of photography that are the tarjetas de visita, or visitors cards. In these cards, in these photographies, the idea of identity and Mexican types are going to be promoted. What is this? Well, they are going to take photographs of people in different trades and occupations. It's mostly street trades, such as cooking, such as selling things, people drinking in cantinas and pulquerias. However, all this is going to be a mise en scene. People are going to be dressed up for the picture, and they are going to appear in the photo performing that, but actually it's going to be dressed up models. So the idea, the intention was to create a notion, an idea of identity. What was hiding this? The real misery that people was living in at this time. During the Porfiriato, around 1877 to 1911, American photographers came to Mexico to send images about tourist and development possibilities. Of course, Mexico was pretty attractive then to the US. So these photographers are going to take photos of occupations, craft, peasants, folk, art, poverty. So it's Mexico seen through foreign eyes. However, this didn't make Porfirio Diaz very happy. Why? Because it was showing the poverty in Mexico, the misery, not the idea that he wanted to send to all around the world, that we were a modern country, that it had a lot of, that it was advancing a lot. The Americans sent this idea that the poor were always with you. The difference now is that the photos were taken in situ, but it was showing realism and context. There were no more models actually, but now real people performing their usual activities. This work wasn't widely known in Mexico. However, as I said, Porfirio Diaz wasn't too happy with this. Diaz, as many others, found in photography a good way of propaganda. So Porfirio Diaz is going to celebrate the first century of the Mexican independence. So he's going to start a project of visual inventory of buildings to show the magnificence of Mexico. For example, at this time we have Guillermo Calo, who is going to take photos of different buildings, modern buildings in Mexico, all buildings that come from colonial times, but that they were very impressive, such as the Basilica de Guadalupe, for example. The idea was to redefine Mexicanidad. We were not only people from pre-Hispanic times with pyramids and buildings from these times, but also we were a modern Mexico that kept its colonial tradition. From this time, it's impossible to do not talk about the Casasola brothers. This family of photographers, they took photographies during the Porfiriato and actually documented the last years of Porfirio Diaz. They made many images of the Mexican revolutions from all sides. However, something important to observe is that many of the photos which appear, like Casasola's photographies, not necessarily were taken by them, but they actually had an eye to buy photos at the time and to keep them in their own archive. They took a lot of photos about the revolution, mostly in the area of Mexico City, which actually give us a good idea about what happened at the time. And why is this important? Well, because we're going to find some changes in photography. Ordinary people are going to appear there, those who were participating in the revolution. The soldiers, the women who were cooking for the soldiers, those women who actually participated in the fights, children, etc. They are going to become interesting for the eye of the photographer. Also, some leaders in the revolution understood the importance of spreading their images, the power of the propaganda. So many of them are going to have their own personal photographers, such as Pancho Villa, Zapata. They are going to have photographers such as Jesus Avitia or Armando Salmerón, which are going to take photos of them posing, and which are going to be spread through different mass media, in the newspapers, for example, at the time. So different from the golden age of Mexican cinema, photography is going to approach to the real people, to the people in their daily lives, showing their traditions, their folklore, what is exotic, with no fear. From this time, we have Manuel Álvarez Bravo, who is going to create new aesthetics, and it's going to portray the ironies of Mexico, how the post-revolutionary speech is going to talk about changes in people's life, positive changes, of course. However, that wasn't necessarily true, and Mexico was still very poor with a big delay economically and socially. In the 1930s to the 1950s, there are going to be some magazines and newspapers which are going to promote visual culture. We're going to find very good writers working with fantastic photographers, working on photo essays, photo reportages, and creating or helping constructing what was considered to be lo mexicano. They are going to explore directly observing the people, the traditions, the folklore, and talking with those who are, that are observed through their lenses. Search for lo mexicano was a constant discussion in the images at the time. Some photographers approached to different angles, let's say, of what Mexico could be, and they, for example, portrayed Mexico's economic situation, and photography became a means of denunciation, a way to show that not necessarily the government was achieving what they were saying they were. Also, they found that lo mexicano was in everyday, ordinary lives. So they started observing, but critically, the workers, the peasants, homeless, the government abuses, Mexico City, etc. And it's going to become a big tradition of photojournalism in Mexico that it comes up to nowadays. Finally, and working very hard, some Mexican female photographers appear to show a different perspective, or looking what Mexicano can be considered through different lenses. Their work shows a multicultural and diverse Mexico, which actually it's very interesting because in some way opposes to the idea of the exotic, or opposes to the idea of what it was created through the Golden Age. We're going to have people like Lola Álvarez Bravo, Mariana Jampolsky, etc., which are going to observe women, but also are going to observe buildings, traditions, etc., through a different perspective that it wasn't seen before they appear with their cameras. So, what are our conclusions? We need to understand that Mexico is a diverse and multicultural country. Therefore, representations of lo mexicano will observe only a piece of what shapes Mexico, never the whole Mexico, or never all the Mexicans. Also, visual culture has had an impact in the constructions of cultural imaginaries, but it also creates stereotypes. This doesn't mean that there is no space of resistance, and the Mexican photography, the photojournalism starting in the 1930s, is a good proof of this, of how something different can be discussed and portrayed through different lenses. Just to finalize, I would like to say that there are many Mexicos. Therefore, there are also many representations of Mexico. So to insist that this represents Mexico, just one thing, seems clearly impossible. Thank you very much. It was great to share this conversation with you. And if you want further information, here is some bibliography that you might be interested in revising. Thank you very much. It was great to talk to you today. Thanks.